Thank you very much. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'm really thrilled to be here and talk to you about something I really love, which is the Census Bureau's population projections. So today, well, my talk is demography destiny, but I'm really going to focus on is how population projections can give you a sneak peek, if you will, into what might the future hold for the U.S. population in terms of demographic characteristics. Just a note for everyone, I'll plan to take questions at the end, particularly when we have people who are remotely accessing the presentation. It's a little awkward if we try to do them during the talk. But we should have plenty of time for discussion, so please do think of some good questions. So my plan for this talk is to start off with some background about what, why, and how we produce population projections. And then I'm going to talk about some results from the 2014 national projections. And I'm going to focus primarily on aging and projections of seeing increases in the older population in our projections. And then I'll finish up by showing you how you can access the projections data for any work that you might be doing that they would be relevant for. So, the U.S. Census Bureau produces national projections. These projections provide a long-term projection, usually about 50 years out into the future. They give us information about how the size and composition of the U.S. population may change over the coming decades. When we release the projections, major media outlets often publish stories. You can see here the headlines from some of our recent releases. Many were focused on immigration as a driver of U.S. population growth, increased diversity of the nation's racial and ethnic composition. And we've also seen a focus this decade in stories about the diversity of the child population, which is projected to become majority minority this decade. And we've also seen stories coming out about what the voting population might look like in the next upcoming presidential and congressional elections. So quite a bit of press when we do have a release. So what do we produce? So the Census Bureau produces national projections. We do this about every 2 years this decade. That's the plan. We released a series in 2012, another in 2014, and then we're hoping to have another series out in 2016. Our projections include demographic detail of age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and starting in 2014, we included nativity, so how many foreign and native-born people there might be in the future in the U.S. We also produce, as I mentioned, the projections typically for a 50-year horizon. We typically go out about 50 years. There's one series a little over a decade ago that went out 100 years. Generally, if we think 100 years, it might be a little bit too hard to try to reach. 50 years is already pushing it when we're trying to make assumptions about how the population might change. So, in addition to national, in the past, the Census Bureau has produced state projections. This product comes out far less frequently, and it is not something that we are actually working on at the moment. We do hope someday that we might be able to revisit this product. There are generally fewer series with that full demographic detail. Most state series are focused on age and sex. Occasionally, we've released state projections that include race and Hispanic origin detail. We have not released a series of state projections with that full detail since 1997, so it's been a little while. We do have links to individual states that produce their own projections. Many states do produce their own estimates and projections, and we have those links on our website, so if you have an interest in a particular state, please do visit census.gov or send me an email. I'll give you my email address at the end of the presentation, and you can see what states are projecting their populations in the future. Why do we produce projections? Well, I really like just to say because it's fun. It's a lot of fun to sit around and think, look at what's gone on in the past and how might that play out into the future. But there are actual real uses for these data. Projections are used as the basis for projections of specific populations by other federal agencies. So some examples include the National Institute on Aging. They're interested in projections of the older population for health planning. The Bureau of Labor Statistics uses our working age population projections to project labor force characteristics. The National Cancer Institute is interested in projection of death to project the incidence of cancer. So this is just some examples. There's many other people out there using our projections in terms of federal agencies. Our projections are also used for resource planning. That might be by local, state governments. They're by businesses. Use them. Also, they're used for academic research. We get a lot of data calls at the Census Bureau about our projections, and it's really fun to see who's calling us. I've had somebody from our church who wanted to know how many people are turning 100. Somebody in our church is going to be 100 this year. We've had Bacardi calling, and that's kind of a fun one. Bacardi cares about what the population is going to look like in the future. And we get a fair number of people in the healthcare industry, in nursing homes and hospitals who are calling interested in how the population might be changing and anticipating what the needs of the population will be for their businesses. So something that we think it's very important to talk about when we come out and give these talks is the difference between estimates and projections. So the Census Bureau produces both population estimates and population projections, and those terms have very specific meanings for us. So estimates, that's the term we use for data that are about the past and present. So if you want to know what was the population size in 2000, that's an estimate. Well, unless you're looking at the census, in which we consider that to be an official count. If you are looking at a date in the future, that's when you're looking at a projection. So if you want to know what do we think the size of the population is going to be in 2020, that's a projection. And projections are almost always based on assumptions about future demographic trends. So when you see both an estimate and a projection available, this happens occasionally as we release new estimates before we release new projections. If you see, for example, a value for both an estimate for 2014 and a projection for 2014, you would want to use the population estimate. Population estimates are based on information we know. We know how many births occurred. We know how many deaths occurred. We're not making assumptions about those things. We have a known value. So you want to use an estimate when it is available. So there's my disclaimer. So how do we make projections? So to make projections, we start off by making some assumptions. We make assumptions about what future rates of fertility and mortality will be, and also what the future levels of international migration will be, people migrating into and then out of the United States. And then once we make those assumptions, it's a very simple equation. We have a starting population. Typically, we start with either the most recent census or the most recent estimate based on the most recent census. We add in the number of births and immigrants that we've projected. We then subtract out the number of deaths and the number of immigrants, people migrating out of the United States, and that gives us the population at a future date. And of course, everybody ages forward 1 year at a time. So we start in, for example, in the 2014 projections, we had a starting point of 2013, and then each year out, we add in births and migration in, we subtract out deaths and people who migrated out, aged everybody forward, and we get that population at a future point in time. So the actual calculating of a projection is pretty simple. Making the assumptions that go into it, that's where we spend most of our time. So the results I'm going to share with you today, to give you a glimpse of what might the future hold for our population, I'm going to talk about the 2014 national projections. We released those just last December, so these are fairly fresh new data. They are the second series of projections that we produced based on the 2010 census. These are projections of the US population. As I mentioned a little bit ago, they're by age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and nativity. So we have quite a bit of detail that we can look at. These projections cover the period from 2014 out to 2060. And these are the first series of projections to incorporate separate assumptions about the fertility rates of Native and foreign-born women. This is something I like to remark upon when I'm doing these talks. Just to comment briefly that the Census Bureau is actively researching and we actively evaluate our projections as we go forward. And one of the things we did this decade was to change up our assumptions about fertility, because the fertility of foreign-born women, their rates are much higher than native-born women. And by not accounting for those differences, we didn't think we would be doing a very good job of projecting future births. So we undertook a research effort this time around to really improve. We hope we're improving. We'll have to wait a little while to see how our projections performed. But this is one of our innovations that we've introduced into the projections to hopefully be producing a product that it really is giving us useful information about where our population might be going. So now you get the pretty graphs. So the Census Bureau, we're statistical geeks. We love to show you data and show you pictures of our data. So the first one, this is just what's going on in terms of the total population, as well as showing you the breakdown by native and foreign-born. So the total US population is projected to increase by 98.1 million between 2014 and 2060. This is an increase from just under 319 million in 2014 to just under 417 million in 2060. So that's those black numbers you see at the top of each column. Now, if you look at the red and the blue sections of the column, the red section is the projected size of the foreign-born population. The blue section of the column is the projected size of the native-born population. And we can see that in 2014, the native population was around 276 million. Between 2014 and 2060, we're projecting the native-born population to increase by 62 million, or 22%, and they are projected to reach 339 million in 2060. At the same time, the foreign-born population is projected to grow from 42 million to 78 million. This is an increase of 36 million, or 85%. So the growth rate for the foreign-born population is projected to be a little bit higher than the native-born. And the foreign-born population, because its rate of growth is projected to outpace that of the native-born, is expected to account for an increasing share of the total population, reaching 19% in 2060, up from 13% in 2014. And that's that yellow line that's along the bottom of the graphic. So as I mentioned, we produce our projections by making assumptions about the components of population changes, what we call them births, deaths, and international migration. So when we break down that change, as I said in the previous slide, we're projecting the US population to increase by 98.1 million between last year and 2060. If we look, I can show you here how the components of change, what components are driving that level of change. So we can see that the change of 98.1 million is the result of adding 197 million births to the population, subtracting 163 million deaths, and adding 64.1 million people through the net effect of migration into and out of the United States. Because these projections are the first to project fertility separately for native and foreign-born women, we can also show you the births divided into how many births were to native-born women and how many to foreign-born women in our projection series. So here you can see about 80% of births, so that was almost 157 million of those births, were projected to be to native-born women, and just under 40% of all births for this entire period are projected to be to foreign-born mothers. So that makes sense because the number of women in their childbearing years in the native population is much larger than the number of women in their childbearing years in the foreign-born population. But this is something that we haven't been able to show before, but now by making separate assumptions for native and foreign-born women, that's a finding we can talk about when we're presenting our results. Okay, so this is something most demographers really like, these graphs. So in this figure, what you're seeing is the US population by age and sex in 2014 and 2060. And because these figures often have a triangular shape, demographers like to call them age-sex pyramids or population pyramids. So they have a vaguely pyramid shape. The bars on the left side of the figure show you the size of the male population by single year of age. So each bar is the size of that age group for males. And then on the right side, you see the projected size of the female population by single year of age. So the idea is you can compare side by side what the male and female populations look like. So the blue bars are showing you the size of the population in 2014. And the red bars, when added to the blue, so if you go to the end of the blue bar and then all the way to the end of the red bar, that's showing you what the projected size of that age group is in 2060. So you can compare between now and 2060 how much change we're projecting to see in individual age groups. So the first thing I want to point out is if you're looking at this, if you look at the bottom of the pyramid with those youngest ages, that's where births are driving growth. So births bring people in at the bottom of the period in age 0, and then they age up as we go forward in time. International migration tends to drive growth or change in the middle section of that pyramid, roughly between the ages of 20 and 50. Most international migrants tend to be younger adults when they arrive in the United States. And then the effects of mortality are our third component. They tend to hit the hardest at the oldest ages. So mortality rates tend to be in the United States highest at the older ages. So when you're looking at the age structure of a population, you can think at the youngest ages, the influence is birth. In the Middle Ages, there's a lot of influence of international migration on change, and then at the top end, that's where mortality is usually having its effect. So, what are we seeing when we look at this graphic? So first, baby boomers are between the ages of 50 and 68 in 2014, and we can see there's a slight bulge in the age distribution in the blue bars in this figure. And we can also see, looking just below the baby boom cohort, the baby bust, if you will, reflected of the indentation in this graph around ages 30 to 40, the late 30s into the early 40s. We also see a slight bulge in the age distribution between the ages of 14 and 35. This represents children born to the baby boomers. Sometimes we we refer to this as the baby boom echo. So another little bulge there. So these bulges and indentations tell us something about generally what's been going on in terms of births. Sometimes when you have something like the influenza epidemic, you can actually see an indentation that results from a large-scale mortality event. Let's see. So we go on down, looking toward 2060, we can see that the most growth in the population between 2014 and 2060 is actually, where you see the most amount of red, is actually in the older ages. So we can see that that biggest difference in population seems to be occurring in the older ages. By 2060, the baby boomers will all be 96 or over, with just over 2 million of them projected to still be alive. And as a result, we no longer see the bulge in the age distribution that's been associated with this cohort. So that's a really big shift. If you look back at a population pyramid for, say, 1960, 1965, as the baby boom was ending, there was a really dramatic bulge at that lower end, the bottom end of the pyramid. And that's something that we're seeing transition away over time. So another thing we notice when we look at the 2060, so that outline by the red bars, is a smoother shape overall in the age distribution. So it's more of a vertical smooth line. We don't see a lot of bulges. We don't see much of a triangular shape anymore. And this is something that, in part, because we're projecting relatively stable growth and smooth growth, no dramatic increases, no baby booms in these projections. So that's why we get such a smooth pattern in the age distribution going out into the future. So, now I showed you just total population, but it's also really interesting if you look at these pyramids, but if you, instead of looking at 2014 on top of 2060, if you look at the foreign-born population in blue on top of the native-born population in red. So this is just for 2014, and I'll show you 2060 next. So there's a lot of differences in the age structures of the foreign and native-born populations. The foreign-born population, those blue bars, have very few people in the younger ages, and this is to be expected as most migrants to the US are 20 and over. And the foreign-born population that have children in the United States, their children are native-born, so they come in those red bars at the bottom. We also see the bulges and the indentations in the pyramid that I noted when we looked at the total population in the previous slide, so the baby boom, the baby bust, the baby echo. These are characteristics of the native-born population. So the baby boom was a native-born population phenomenon, not something we see reflected in the foreign-born population. If we look out to 2060, so a little bit of change, but we still see that foreign-born population still largely concentrated in the age group 20 and over. But now we're starting to see for the foreign-born, those blue bars are getting bigger at the older ages. So it's not just the native-born population that we're projecting to see age. We're projecting that the foreign-born living in the United States will also be aging. So some of them will leave, but some of them will stay and they will grow older. So we're seeing that shift in their age distribution. We can also see that increase again of the native-born population at the older ages. So really those older ages are where we're seeing a lot of that growth. So, since I've been focusing on aging, let's just look at a graph where we can see what is going on with that older population. So here you're seeing the projections of the population 65 and over. The red bars show you the size of that population over the coming decades, and then that blue line is showing you what percent the population 65 and older is projected to make of the entire US population. Between 2014 and 2060, our nation's older population is projected to more than double, increasing from 46 million in 2014 to 98 million in 2060. So that's a lot of growth for an age group. The growth of the older population will be driven by the aging of the baby boomers. Baby boomers started turning 65 in 2011, and by 2030, all of the baby boomers will be 65 and over. And we can see that, indeed, by 2030, 1 in 5 Americans are projected to be 65 and over. So just over 20% of our total population is projected to be in the older ages by that point. Right now, it's around 15%. The proportion of our population that is 65 and older is projected to remain at just above 20% through 2060. So something I enjoy looking at is, what's going on in terms of percent change in the population. If we look at each decade going forward, how much growth are we really expecting to see? The total population, if you look at the first columns, and the blue is the total population, red is the older population. The total population last decade grew by 10%. So when we compare Census 2000 to the 2010 census, we saw a 10% increase in our national population. The population going forward, if you follow and keep looking at those blue columns, you see that we're projecting slower growth over time. And by the end of this projection period, looking out to the 2040s and the 2050s, we're projecting just 5% increase in the total population. So half the amount of increase by the end of these projections is what we saw last decade. In contrast, the older population, as I just noted, we're projecting a lot of growth in the proportion and size of the older population. And this decade, we're projecting an almost 40% increase in the number of people 65 and over. And between 2020 and 2030, as the remainder of those baby boomers move into that age category, we're projecting another 31% jump in that population size. Once all the baby boomers have aged into that group, the population growth rate for the older population is projected to come down quite a bit. So 11% in the 2030s, down to 7% in the 2040s. And then in the 2050s, it comes back up a little bit as that baby boom echo starts moving its way through. Sometimes, some might refer to those as the millennials. So the millennials are going to get there. Right now, they're the young 20-somethings, but they're getting older. Something I've really enjoyed looking at with this series of projections is not just how many older people will there be in the United States, but in these projections, we're actually seeing a shift in the composition of the older population. So here you're looking, this is each segment of these bars is a percentage of the total population 65 and over, and which age group they fall in, whether it's 65 to 74, what percent are in the 75 to 84, and what percent are in the oldest age category of 85 and over. And looking at 2014, the majority, 57% of the older population, is between 65 and 74 years of age. As we look forward, it's very intriguing to me that the 85 and over population is increasing quite a bit. And their share of that older population we're projecting to be 20% in 2060. That's up from around 13% now. So it's not just that our nation's getting older, but we're projecting life expectancy to increase and that people will be living longer, which means that people will not only reach age 65, but they'll be more likely to reach age 85. So particularly for those who are doing forecasting at Social Security or anybody looking at healthcare, anything like that, this is something that's very interesting and something they think a lot about. So this is another graph I'm going to take just a moment to walk through. It's another tool demographers like to use, and I really wanted to share this with you. We call these dependency ratios. So dependency ratios are another way we can examine the changing age structure of the population. We can look at the younger as well as older populations relative to the size of the population in the traditional working ages. And here we're using 18 to 64. There's many ways you can define the working age population. So some might say 20 to 64, some might be moving that 64 up to 67. So you can use whatever age group you like. We're using 18 to 64. Regardless, you're going to see the same kind of trend. So what dependency ratios do for us is they give us an indicator of the potential burden of the dependent population. So we're considering those who are children and those who are older. Right now, we think they're less likely to be in the labor force, so they're more likely to be dependent. And then we've got the people in the working age population, which we typically think most of them might be working and supporting themselves. So we calculate the ratio. We take the number of people in the dependent age group, the younger or older, or both, and we divide it by the number of people in the working age population. And then we multiply by 100. So it's almost like looking at a percent. So the higher the dependency ratio, the more dependence you have relative to the size of your working age population. And the smaller the number, the fewer dependents you have. So the old age dependency ratio, which is the red line on this graphic, is projected to increase, and this is because of the increasing share of our nation's population that's projected to be 65 and older. So relative to other other age groups in the population, as the older population increases its share, the share in the younger ages goes down, and we see the dependency ratio come up. We actually see something I haven't seen looking back in time, that the old age dependency ratio is projected to surpass the youth dependency ratio. So that's the blue line. Those are the people 18 and under relative to the people in the working ages. So this is something I haven't seen it in any estimates as far back as I've ever looked. So that's a new thing that we see coming. I don't think it's overly surprising. I think most people are aware that we're an aging population. People are getting older. We have more older people in the population. The other thing to note is if we add that youth and old age dependency ratio together, we get the black line, which is total dependency. And we see that the total dependency ratio is going up, and that increase is very much a result of the increase in the old age dependency ratio in these projections. If you look back into the 1950s and the 1960s when the baby boom was happening and we had that large increase in the younger age groups, we saw a big increase in the youth dependency ratio. So we have seen increases and higher youth dependency ratios over time. And the same effect on the total dependency. If the youth dependency ratio goes up, so does total dependency. But for some people it matters, whether it's the younger population or the older population that's driving that trend. Okay. So, well, I mentioned we do projections by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. So I showed you the pyramids by sex, but there's not a lot of difference by sex, so I didn't dwell on that at that moment. But I did want to talk a little bit about sex. So in terms of the older population, it's interesting to look at the percent female. So I think some people may be aware, if you go to a nursing home or an assisted care facility, very often you see more women than men. And that is because there is typically a higher percentage of women relative to men in the older population. So female life expectancy has long exceeded male life expectancy. Females are projected, in the past they've been estimated to live slightly longer than men. So as a result, we end up with slightly more women than men in our population, particularly at the older ages. So we can see here, looking at the older population in the 65 and over population, the total, just that first set of columns, in 2014, 56% are projected to be female. This is projected to decrease a little bit. So as life expectancy goes up and both men and women live a little bit longer, the percent female is projected to go down a little bit, so down to 54% overall. It's really striking when we look at the 75 and over, so the last two sets of columns, that the percentage of the older population that's projected to be female it's projected to decrease, and that decrease is much more notable when we look at the oldest of the older population. So a drop from 57 to 54% for the 75 and over, a drop from 66% to 60% for the 85 and over. And race and Hispanic origins. So to summarize what trends we're projecting in terms of race and Hispanic origin, I've done something we occasionally do at the Census Bureau, but this is not an official practice. Sometimes we look at just the percent minority, and here we're defining minority as any group other than non-Hispanic white alone. And I'm showing you both the total population and the 65 and over population. So the blue bars is the percent minority in the total US population. Between 2014 and 2060, we're seeing projecting an increase in the percent minority. Some would say it's projecting an increase in the diversity of the US population. We see an increase from around 38% in 2014 being something other than non-Hispanic white alone. And by 2060, we're projecting 56% of the total US population will be something other than non-Hispanic white alone. This has been talked about as the majority-minority crossover. It's the point at which no group would have greater than a 50% share of the total US population, at least the groups as we've defined race and Hispanic origin groups today. And if we look at the 65 and over population, those red columns, we're also seeing a projected increase in diversity for the older population. The older population is not quite as diverse as the total or the younger segments of the population, but it is seeing an increase in its diversity as well. So around 22% of our older population is minority today, and by 2060 we're projecting around 45%. So even for the older population, almost half by 2060 are projected to be something other than non-Hispanic white alone as well. So. Something else I wanted to share with you, partially because it's interesting in terms of an aging perspective, but it also shares some other data we have available at the Census Bureau, is the US in international context. So the Census Bureau produces projections for all of the countries, and well, most of the countries in the world. We don't do them just for the United States. So we have an international database on our website, so you can get information about the age and sex and the total population size for other countries in the world, as well as the United States. So aging is something in particular when we hear about low fertility countries in Europe. Aging is a phenomenon happening worldwide. So here you're seeing a selected set of developed countries and some of the largest developing countries compared. 2014 is on the left, and then their percent 65 and over is in 2050 is shown on the right. The reason I'm showing you 2050 here and not 2060 as I did in the previous slides is because our international database only goes out to 2050 at the present time. So I had to scale back 10 years. So you can see I've highlighted the United States in red. So you can see in 2014, 15% of our population is 65 and over. And if we look forward to 2050, 22% of our population is projected to be 65 and over. If you go all the way to the top of this graph, we can see that the world overall is getting older. Right now, about 8% of the world's population is 65 and over. By 2050, that's projected to increase to about 17%. So it's about a little over double the size of the older population today. If we look then at some of the other countries, we can see that the US, compared to other developed countries, if you focus on the 2050 bars, we're actually projected to remain one of the youngest developed countries in the world. So Japan is projected to have 40% of its population aged 65 and over by 2050. You can see countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, over 30% of their countries are projected to be in that older age group. So population aging is happening pretty much around the world, but the United States is not projected to be getting as old as some of those other countries in the world, and that's in large part due to differences in fertility. Fertility in the US is not as low as it is in countries like Japan and countries in Europe, and we're not projecting that it will be dropping to those levels in our series. So I've also shown the largest developing countries. So you can see that the US, if we compare the US to China, to Indonesia, to India, right now we're a little bit older. China has about 10% of their population in the older age groups. Indonesia and India have 7 and 6% of their populations in the 65 and over group. Looking forward, we can see by 2050, China is projected to have 27% of their population, over a quarter of their population in the older age groups. That's a larger percentage than the United States is projected to have. And we can see Indonesia and India, they're both increasing toward the 20% mark in 2050. So I think it's interesting to think of the US and think in terms of that global perspective, where we think we're going to be fitting in the future. So just to summarize, here's what I hope you took away from my talk thus far. So the US population is projected to increase from 319 million to 417 million between 2014 and 2060. We are projecting the population to grow more slowly in the future than it did in future decades than it did in the recent past. By 2060, nearly 1 in 5 of the nation's total population is projected to be foreign-born. The older population is projected to more than double, growing from 46 million in 2014 to 98 million in 2060. And if you didn't remember, that growth of the older population is very much going to be driven by the aging of the baby boomers as they continue to age into the 65 and over group. So again, by 2030, 1 in 5 people living in the United States will be 65 years and older. Despite the increase in the share of the US population in the older ages, our nation is projected to remain one of the youngest developed countries in the world. And then the final slides, how you can access our data. So the first one here, I'm showing you how you can access the US projections data. If you just go to census.gov, there's a topics tab at the top of the page, and you'll find a link to the projections there. I'll show my email address in a moment, and I have cards for those of you in the audience, and I think the slides will be posted, so feel free to email me for direct links. And I'm showing you a screenshot there. You can see that we have a very good communications directorate. They've got a they've been updating our website, so we've got links to our news releases, our publications, working papers, and of course the data. So we have some nice summary tables, and those of you who really like to get into data, there are downloadable files that you can read into whatever statistical software you like to use. In addition, I mentioned our international database. This is a really, really wonderful tool. They've organized their data a little bit differently. So when you go to the international database, again, if you just go to census.gov, that topics link at the top of our page will get you to the international data, or you have the URL right there. They have a nice interactive tool. You can actually go into the past. They have both estimates and projections. Pick what year you want. You can pick individual countries. You can pick world regions. They have the UN regions, as well as some other region groupings, the State Department, for example, their groupings. You can look at individual data, aggregated data, and you can pick where you see the demographic overview on Select Report. You can click that drop-down menu and pick if you want to see age, if you want to see sex, if you want broad age groups, detailed age groups. They have a lot of really interesting information there. And they do read our US projections in, so you can get our US projections through their tool as well. So hopefully, yes, good. I've left some time for questions. Though while we're waiting for the questions to come in, please feel free to jot down my information if you don't have time to get your question in.
And just to note, we will be posting slides and video on library.doc.gov. So for the WebEx folks asking, they will be available later. And to the people in the audience, if you have questions, Karen has a microphone. I'd just like to start with a WebEx question, since we had a couple similar. Could you just clarify, when you're talking about like the population pyramid, are you talking about people in the U.S. legally, illegally, U.S. citizens, undocumented people? Could you just clarify sort of what the definition of?
Sure. That's a great question, and asking clarifying questions is a very good thing to do, so I highly encourage it. It's very important to know what data are we presenting, what information are we presenting to you. So the Census Bureau measures the foreign-born population. We do not distinguish by legal status. Our surveys do sometimes ask if people are citizens or not, but our projections are based on, we look at past trends in international migration. We use census and survey data to look at how many people have migrated into the United States. There's no distinguishing based on legal status in those measures. So we hope that when we collect a census in particular, as well as our survey data, we're representing everyone living in the United States, so the resident population of the United States.
Excellent, thank you. Questions in the room?
Thank you. I was just curious, when you're making your projections about life expectancy 40 and 50 years down the road, how do you account for changes in medical technology? Is that just based on past increases in life expectancy, or are you consulting with professionals in the field? How does that get generated?
So we certainly think a lot about if we're projecting a trend or an increase. So we generally, with all of our components, let me start with all of our components, we're generally projecting just a trend out into the future that's based on the trend we saw in the past. And we're not tying it to any policy or any technological innovation. That would be next to impossible to do. We don't know what's coming next. If we did, we'd be able to invest in whatever company is going to be the next big thing. But what we do is so for the mortality projections, we make assumptions about what the ultimate life expectancy value is. Demographers have a lot of debate if there's a limit to life expectancy, or nobody could ever live past 115, that sort of thing. But we go out to around, we say, we think 100 is probably around the ultimate level. And then we have all of we do this by age, and we look by sex, and then some race and Hispanic origin groups, because there are differences in mortality rates when you look at those groups. And we project each group to be moving in general toward that ultimate life expectancy. Any group that has a bigger difference between now and what that ultimate level is will be projected to have a greater improvement. And the groups that are closer to that ultimate level will have a smaller improvement, the way we make our assumptions. So something we do when we project out, we do evaluate, and we spend a lot of time looking at that projected trend for that component to think, does it make sense? So we hope there would be technological innovations, that we would see increases in life expectancy due to something, we've found some treatment for cancer or some disease that has a high mortality rate. So we look at our projection to think, do we think it's likely that this increase could happen? And we do look at things. We look at innovations in medical technology over the past. We look at the kind of increase you saw in life expectancy, the decrease in mortality rates at those points in time. and try to factor in whether or not the assumptions we're making in the future make sense to us now.
Great. Another in the room? And then we'll get you next.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Schaefer with ITA. Thank you so much for the presentation. Can you speak to any of the in-sample tests you might have done for performance with the projections, like comparing projections that have been published in the past with actual data?
Sure. So we do, we actively evaluate our projections. So obviously we haven't had a chance to evaluate these projections because we haven't seen, we don't have, generally when we have a new census count, that would be a time when we compare, okay, where did our projections get us compared to what the census count came into or came in as. But we have some evaluation papers up on our website. So we do run tests. We look at how big were the differences, looking at differences by age group, by sex, by race and Hispanic origin, though that's tricky because the census, if you look at the decennial census, we've never asked the race and Hispanic origin question the same way twice. So those are things that those definitions change over time. But we do evaluate, we compare and see, and we look at the components. So were we off in terms of fertility? Did we miss the mark in terms of international migration, that sort of thing? An example of how we do those evaluations and how that feeds into our product. And when I came on board with the Census Bureau in 2009, they just released a series of projections in 2008. And those assumptions for international migration that went into those projections were largely based on patterns of migration up through the year 2000. After 2000, net international migration levels came down, and they were much more, they actually fell. And overall, the trends last decade was much more stable and smooth and flat compared to the increases we saw in the 80s through the 90s. So our projections, based on a time series that ended just after 2000, had international migration going up quite a bit. But as we saw the 2000 decade play out, we realized that assumption didn't make sense with what we were seeing. So that's why we released a set of projections in 2009 where we altered our assumptions about international migration. We did a higher series and a lower series. If you're going to go lower, you might as well go higher and just see what the range is. How much effect does it have on the population? And we also did a constant series. And so those projections all started with Census 2000. So when we compared to the 2010 census, in general, our constant and low migration series did much better in terms of comparing to the total population than any of the other series. So that's when we evaluate and we see something like that happening, we do try to feed that into the next set of projections so we can constantly correct based on what we know now.
I had a couple of questions. I was wondering, first of all, to sort of piggyback on the evaluation reports that you say you do periodically to sort of check the accuracy or the how close you get in your projections when you get to compare it with actual data. Do you have an opportunity to sort of try to figure out how your process is improved? Do you get to do larger sample sizes, better surveys, better measuring techniques? What sort of techniques and tools help you improve your projections, or do you have some sort of steady improvement in your projections, and what do you get to attribute to those improvements if they're there?
That's a really interesting question. I've never had it phrased quite that way before. I really like that, though, because when I think in terms of improvements in our projections, it's a really interesting thing to ponder because, I mean, overall, I think we do make improvements in our projections, particularly, when you start doing them and you do them longer and longer and you realize, I mean, one lesson I've learned is it doesn't benefit you necessarily to get really complicated. We've experimented, some people like doing probabilistic projections, forecasting. If you've ever seen those results, you end up with, 100, 200, 200,000 lines, and then they take the average. And then they can actually have a confidence interval around it for those of you who are more interested in the statistics. But at the end of the day, for the purpose that our projections are used, we've actually found that simpler assumptions are sometimes the best. So that we don't want to give a sense of false confidence in the projection. I mean, our projection is only as good as our ability to anticipate the future. We've seen, fertility rates the overall rates for some groups have been very stable over the last 20 years. But, we could have a baby boom coming around the corner in 10 years. We don't know. And there's no way even a probabilistic model would actually anticipate that. So in terms of improvements, I think we try very hard to learn lessons from the past and carry those forward. And not make things needlessly complicated when they don't need to be. And we want to make sure it's a product that we have some very sophisticated data users that use it, but we also want it to be something that the general public can understand and use. In terms of how we evaluate, and you mentioned surveys. So the projections are based, the census is always the starting point, and the census is considered a full count of the US population. So it's not considered a survey. So there's no sampling error, there's no margin of error with the census. So that's not something that really feeds into a projection. We do use survey data to some extent to help build our time series going back in time for international migration, for example. So certainly if the survey data were off in estimating international migration, our projections might be off as well. So that's a risk we take. But that's not really something, we're not really involved in the evaluations of those data. In the job I recently took on, I'm actually much more involved in the survey side, working with the American Community Survey, the current population survey. And there are efforts at all levels of data collection, data processing, evaluating the tables that come out. So looking at how we do the sampling, to make sure we're reaching a representative set of households, making sure that if a field representative goes out to talk to somebody that they're coding and entering data properly. There's work at all levels to evaluate the data, to evaluate the accuracy of the data, and to figure out what improvements we can make, because the Census Bureau really does pride itself on being the leading source of statistics about the nation's people, economy, well, other agencies do economy as well, but it's very important to us that we do have quality data out there. So we do spend a lot of time doing evaluation and review of our data.
This is Ron. I just want to say thank you very much, Jennifer. I just realized how many reports I've seen with your name on it after going back when you said American Community Survey. And going back to the questions that were asked before, I think you actually almost answered all those questions, because keeping it simpler, keeping it clear, and making it impactful. My question is, to what extent do you look at the impact and the outliers? While you're keeping it simple and while you're staying on message to keep it clear, do you take into account any type of cataclysmic events or disruptive technologies or wars or events like that, or policy making that maybe is just outside the typical immigration gatekeeping that would typically take place, based on scare? Do you look at just keeping a more consistent view of how the future projections will be going, or do you actually take into account these so-called once-in-a-while cataclysmic events or disruptive, life-shaking programs that happen, like matriculation when a war happens, for instance? Thank you, and thank you to your team.
Sure. So that's a really good question. Making a projection it's all about what if. What if this happens? If there's a war, if there's a famine, if there's an earthquake, if there's a hurricane, particularly people who are doing, there's some really interesting work. What we do is fun, but there's some people who are actually projecting what happens as sea levels rise and how will communities be impacted. So anybody doing projections or forecasting, we're all thinking about what if this happens. So we are not building into assumptions that if there is some sort of cataclysmic event, this is what the outcome would be. But what we do try to help inform our data users, we provide alternative assumptions about different components. So more recently, we've been focusing on alterations of the level of international migration. If it was a higher or a lower level, how much different would our future population be? In general, we still see the population is growing. We're projecting that we're going to get to 400 million by 2060. We're going to see that majority-minority crossover happen. The older population is going to get bigger either way. But you can see how sensitive the projection might be to something like that. So in the past, we used to, back in the 60s, the 70s, the Census Bureau has been doing projections since, I think the first set came out in 1947. If you're familiar with the Census Bureau, the name Jacob Siegel will be one familiar to you. He worked on those. We used to do alternative assumptions for all the components. So they'd do 5 for fertility, 5 for mortality, 5 for migration. You can imagine that's a lot of different numbers coming out. Now we try to stick with one main series and then pick one component to provide variation around. So I think we've been talking about making some different assumptions about fertility. What if we brought fertility rates up? What if they came up? What if they hit replacement level or above? So we consider a fertility rate of 2.1, so the average number of children we're projecting a woman to have. 2.1, just over 2, would be 2 people replacing themselves in the population. So that's replacement level. So, but what if we bumped the overall level up to 2.5? So see what happens then. I mean, we have an idea, but actually, we can actually run the numbers and see how big of an impact it has. And the same thing with mortality. There's been a lot of work on mortality and thinking about mortality projections. 2 topics of interest lately have been obesity and smoking. So the impacts as we see changes in our population in terms of how many people are obese, how many people smoke, or don't smoke, hopefully, if you're seeing trends going that direction, what impact might that have? So some people have actually tried to build that assumption into a projection. But what we would do is, what if we altered the life expectancy? Or we took some age cohorts and made some assumptions that maybe their life expectancy will actually deviate from the overall trend. So those are ideas we've been entertaining, and hopefully we'll be able to put out some additional scenarios. But our approach right now is to provide scenarios to show you if something changed, here's how much of an impact it has on the population.
Anyone else in the room? I think all right, we've got one more. I'm going to interject one WebEx while Karen gives the microphone to the person. Can ACS be used to produce state projections?
Producing state projections. I mean, you certainly, first of all, there's a lot of ways you can do projections. What our method, we call it the cohort component method. So we make assumptions about fertility rates, mortality rates, international migration, and we do that by age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and obviously nativity, since we have that in there. Some people actually, they'll just look at, overall change in the past few decades and then assume that trend will continue. You can even take, if you have Microsoft Excel, you can put in a trend and graph it and it will add a projection line for you. So there's a lot of ways you can do them, and then there's people who like to run very sophisticated probabilistic models. You can feed as much or as little data as you want into it. In terms of doing state projections, that's something we haven't been doing for a long time, and unfortunately we haven't gotten to spend a lot of time thinking about in the last couple of decades. You could certainly look at American Community Survey data, but ultimately something to be aware, the American Community Survey data, the way we get everything ratcheted up to a state total or a national total, we use our population estimates. So those are estimates of the total population. They serve as survey controls. So a survey, we sample a subset of people in the population, and then we use controls to weight that up so you can have a sense of how many total people in the US or total people in a state or in a county have this characteristic or this composition. So if you're looking at a specific trend, something I've done in the past is to project out language use. So we've taken our national projections, we've looked at American Community Survey data on language use, how many people speak a language other than English at home, and we projected some trends in different ways and then applied them to our projections to say, well, here's how many Spanish speakers we might see in 2020. So that's one way we've used it, and that's certainly something if you had a state projection you could apply. But I would generally say sticking with the population estimates and those trends would be a better way to go. But if you really want to know about state projections, I really encourage you to go to our website and check out individual states doing their own projections. There are some really amazing projections out there, some people who've done some really great work, and particularly at the state level, bringing in economic information. That's really important for getting a sense of how many people do you think are going to migrate into and out of your state. As an example. So states are actually feeding in additional information, not just the demographics, and that's something that's really important for them to do.
This is a fascinating topic, and thank you for the presentation. I was curious to know why the Hispanic Latino population was fit into these projections and not other groups like especially the Asians and other groups of immigrants?
So we do, so the Census Bureau follows the guidelines for federal statistical data collection and reporting on race and Hispanic origin. So we start with the census data. So census data, we collect information about race, and race includes the categories of white, black or African American, Asian is in there, and of course Asian encompasses several groups. American Indian or Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander. And then, of course, starting in 2000, people are allowed to select as many race groups as they feel represents them. So you can have any possible combination of those 5 groups. I think I got them all 5 listed. And then for ethnicity, the OMB standards are to ask if somebody's Hispanic or not. So those are the categories that we collect data in. And if there were to be a change, if there's a change in the 2020 census and what groups were used, I would anticipate that both our estimates and projections would potentially be changing as well. So that's where we get our groups that we produce estimates, projections, and the survey data come in those categories as well.
Great.
Thank you again for coming to give this presentation. So I've read some articles about how women are waiting to give birth or not having as many children. And I wondered if that factored into your projections or if it had any impact on your projections.
Yeah, I like that question. You guys are asking great questions. So let me thank you all for those questions now. So in terms of delaying childbearing, that's certainly something we think is happening. The real question will be are the women who have not yet had a baby, if they've gone through their 20s or even their 30s and they haven't had a birth, will they? So sometimes we see yes. We're still waiting for some of that to play out. We're going to have to wait a few more years before. So as women, if they hit 50 and they haven't had a child, then we could say, probably not going to happen, at least not you actually bearing a child yourself. So in terms of our fertility projections, we're looking at fertility rates by age over the past 20 or so years. So if we're seeing that, women, certainly we would be reflecting the period trends. If fertility rates are low for women in their 20s, but they're starting to creep up a little bit in the 30s or the 40s, we will reflect that. But if we have delaying going on and the women haven't gotten to the point where they're actually having the babies, then our fertility rates at those older ages might still be a little bit low. Whereas, so if you're talking about somebody who's age 30 now, but they have a birth at age 40, which would be 10 years into our projection, that we might not be reflecting that because the overall trend is probably not going to be going up for that age group yet, not necessarily. So I don't think that our fertility projections are necessarily biased by that, but certainly the rates might end up being a little bit higher than what we have in the present and what we've projected for the future. But that's an example of something that we do kind of consider that when we look and evaluate the trend before we put it into the projection. And then we do monitor each year. We get data from the National Center for Health Statistics on births, and we do evaluate those data and see what's happening, what trends, what changes. For example, births, we see increases and decreases, and so adding one more year of data can actually make a difference in the projection. So that's something we're always keeping an eye on.
Great. I just want to say thank you to all the patient WebEx people. We still have about a dozen questions for you.
Okay.
The next one is we often read and hear headlines about earthquakes, typhoons, environmental accidents, or even global warming effects on our life. How should the average voter respond to lack of attention given to this important topic of anemic population growth affecting the quality of life in the U.S.? Is this a case of what we don't know is hurting us? What do we need to know from media and government leaders to better understand and respond to the need for population growth in our country? And this same person had a couple questions that you can probably tie in as well related to what social policies is the U.S. considering adopting to increase birth rate, and what could U.S. policy do to encourage another baby boom?
So, well, those are some very well thought out questions, very detailed. So the Census Bureau's role here is we are providing demographic data, and that's what my job has been as a Census Bureau employee. We provide demographic data and information for, one use is for policymakers to look at what our population projections are. We try to provide the best assumptions going out into the future based on what we've seen in the past, and that's, we hope, a tool and a resource. We're here to provide information for people to use. And so that's something that a policymaker or somebody in one of those fields might look at. So that is our role here, to provide that kind of information. So we can give a sense today of what we think the growth of the U.S. population might be, or growth by age, growth by a particular race or Hispanic origin group. But it's for others who are interested in our data to use that to make, to have information when they're thinking about policy decisions.
Great. Can you give an idea on how you adjust forecasts and models based on data sources like birth rates and immigrations that are more dynamic versus sources of data that are more static, like actual census or people counting?
Well, our projections are based just on the components of change. So we certainly would look at a long-term trend. You know, how much has the population grown over the last 50, 100 years? You know, are we showing some sort of, major shift from that long-term trend or not? That's part of an evaluation. But we're very much focused on what have the trends been in births and deaths and international migration, and carrying that long-term trend out into the past. Mm-hmm. So, and that's why we continually evaluate. We look at every time we get a new population estimate, a new census count, new birth, death, or international migration data, we look at our projections compared to what we're seeing and see, does our projection still make sense? Benefit of doing projections every 2 years is if we start to see a shift, we can make an update so that we'll have a current set of projections that really reflect, as of that date, what we know.
Great. How does the population projection help with healthcare? How does our government use this data in regards with our economy and business?
So population projections, I think a good example, and it's a good opportunity for me to point out, the Census Bureau is not the only agency that does projections of the U.S. population. The Social Security Administration also produces their own set of projections. Their projections are they're not quite as focused on detailed demographic data like ours are, because they have to factor in things like disability rates and that sort of thing, because ultimately Social Security is interested in projecting demand for their different funds. So that's an example of an agency I think you could consider an agency interested in healthcare. They're producing a set of projections that can be used as a set of information for those who are doing the policy, who are making policy, who are planning out for the future.
Great. What societal factors do you think contribute to baby booms? Did you see one after 9/11, for example?
Well, baby booms, I mean, the baby boom that we typically refer to when we're talking as demographers, that's the one from 1946 to 1964. I mean, there's a variety of societal factors, and there's lots of sociologists in particular who've spent careers studying this phenomenon. And you see little baby booms. For those of you who live in DC, you might remember a few years ago we had a thing we like to call Snowmageddon, and